Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, November 9th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. Whether you are watching me live here or watching this back as a recording, appreciate you giving me some of your attention. We've got some great questions to walk through today. Excited to jump into it here. I hope everybody's Monday night NFL showdown or Monday night NBA main slates or NHL main slates went well last night. Had a decent sweat for me, actually, in NBA going well into that late game, but ended up going to bed early. I'm not too much of a night owl here. Waking up, I had fallen down quite a bit. Still a decent night over me. I think I ended up coming in about 3x overall. So always take the profitable night, but was very close to a very, very profitable night for me. But, we take those and move on here. We've got some good questions in the queue here for today. Want to spend a little bit of time talking about, kind of what's going on with SaberSim, like what behind the scenes. Got a few questions about some of the sliders overall. So I think a good opportunity to take a step back, kind of talk about, some of the basics of how the tool's working. A few other interesting questions here about leverage and pool size and filtering. So plenty to talk about here today. As always, if you have questions, pop them into the queue, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or the YouTube chat. I try to answer these questions as best I can in chronological order. So the sooner you get your question in here, I've gone a little blurry. There we go. Sooner you get your question in here, the sooner I will get to it. I do quickly just want to shout out, I know Epic Problem here posted in the Office Hours channel in Slack earlier this morning about a podcast version of this show. He says that he listens to this in his car a lot, and it is a little bit tricky watching or not, hopefully not watching, right? But keeping a YouTube video playing through your car. It might be easier if there was a podcast version of this. So a few people have already chimed in and said that would be useful. I don't know why I keep going blurry here today. Few people have already chimed in and said that would be useful. Definitely can look into getting that set up on our end. If that would be useful, if having a podcast version of the show would be useful to you, that would be something you actually use. Shout it out in YouTube chat or Office Hours. Would love to just kind of get an idea of about how many people would use this. Again, I already see that there's a handful of people that have raised their hands, but we've talked about doing this in the past. I wasn't sure how many people were actually, watching this on YouTube versus just listening to the audio or whatever. So if that's something that people want, definitely can look into getting that set up, maybe on Spotify or whatever works there. So yeah. Anyway, just wanted to do a quick announcement there. Last thing, I guess, on the housekeeping side of things before we jump into questions, planning on doing another strategy session this Thursday here. Still figuring out exactly what that's going to look like. Probably maybe a little bit more of just kind of like, rather than a sport-specific strategy session here, kind of thinking about something, a little bit more DFS process related, right? Building out a winning process and thinking how to think about your process and make improvements in a way that is actually adding value. Figuring out exactly what that's going to look like, but excited about that. Look forward to that here towards the end of the week. But other than that, I think we'll go ahead and start diving into questions. We'll get the stream pulled up. Just a little 3-game slate on the NBA side of things tonight. I think there's a 10-game NHL slate if you're interested in playing that. If you do end up diving into that NHL slate tonight, check out the strategy session from last week where I had Couch and Mr. Clean on talking a little hockey strategy with me. I know Mr. Clean has been answering a bunch of questions in the NHL channel lately, so that's awesome. But let's go ahead and start diving in. So I'm going to start here. And this was a question that came in from Wes yesterday, right at the end of my stream. And he said he's got a few questions, so we're going to answer all these questions. I'm going to read them first. But I'm actually going to start this question a little bit, maybe earlier than from the point that the question's written. So let's go ahead and read it first. There's a few questions in here. We'll read the question, we'll talk about this. But Wes said, I don't completely understand what the ownership fade slider is doing, even after a bunch of tests to experiment, putting correlation and sim variance at 0 and the ownership fade slider to 10. And then we go first question. Why am I getting different results each time if the sim variance slider is set to 0? I'm assuming there's some kind of randomness being applied on each build. I don't want that because I'm confident in my projections. Second question, as an experiment, I set James Conner and Chase Edmonds, two 5,300 running backs, to the same exact ownership and point projection, yet I'm getting different exposures or leverage scores for the two different players. My best guess is this has something to do with each player's range of outcomes. I consistently get more Chase Edmonds and believe this is because his ceiling is higher. But again, I believe my point projections and ownership projections are strong. This tweak could hurt my EV and so on. I think it finishes. I watched a few office hours videos, but don't exactly know what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. So I want to actually kind of start answering this question by explaining what is going on behind the scenes, both with what your custom projections and your custom ownership are doing, how they interact with the sims, and also what each of the individual sliders are doing, because I think there's some questions here. Because I think if I can explain well, I will explain here. I'll wrap around and I'll tell you how to get lineups that are perfectly optimized for your projections and get the same thing every time. We'll wrap around to that point. But I think if I do a good job explaining here what's happening with each of these sliders, I don't think you're going to end up wanting to turn sim variance to 0. So let's start here. So first of all, our projections, right? Looking at Giannis's projection for tonight's slate, 54.36. That is an average. That is a geometric mean of his average performance across our game simulations, right? So we have simulated the Bucks Sixers game thousands of times, right? And this is what his range of outcomes look like. So he has a wide range of outcomes here. His average across all of the different game simulations is 54.36, right? When you update a projection, and maybe your custom projection is 56.36, we are going to take all of the individual game simulations we have of this game and increase Giannis's point output in those individual sims by 2, right? You have increased his mean point output by 2, so we are going to increase the individual game simulations for every game we have for Giannis by 2 points, right? So it's important here when we start to kind of talk about the sliders. So let's talk about what each of the sliders are doing. So correlation, 3-game slate on NBA, low correlation sport, it's going to be at 0, but often it's going to have a non-zero value, right? The correlation slider is using the individual correlation values we have for each player that are again determined by using our game simulations, right? By simulating out every game play by play thousands of times, we can actually quantify exactly how correlated different players are to one another. The correlation slider is going to determine how much to weight that, right? The ownership fade slider, and I know this is one of the questions here where there is confusion. So what the ownership fade slider is doing is it is taking a player's projected ownership, whether that is SaberSim's projected ownership or your custom projected ownership. It is comparing that player's ownership value to the average ownership at the position to make a determination on if that player is higher owned than average at their position or lower owned than average at their position. It is looking at that player's variance, how wide their range of outcomes, how unlikely they are potentially to hit their mean outcome, more or less. Or ceiling, I guess. And if a player is high variance and higher owned than average at their position, this ownership fade slider will be more likely to fade that player. The way it actually literally works is that there is a multiplier applied to that player's projection based on how over or under owned we think that player is. The higher this value is, the more likely players that are highly owned and highly variant are likely to be faded in your lineups. And finally, the sim variance slider. And I want to make sure I do a good job explaining what this slider does, because I think this is the most important slider, especially for GPP play, right? So what the sim variance slider does is that the higher values of this slider, right? We are going to take random buckets of game simulations from our thousands of game simulations of each game on the slate, and use the average projections that a player scored in that subset of game simulations as the projections for each player when we build every single individual lineup. We are essentially sampling at random all of the different game outcomes that can happen in the game when we build each individual lineup. And when we get to the next lineup, we resample the games. It is most easily visualized at 10, where we're using single game simulations to determine the projections when we build each lineup. Right. So at 10, we would take a single Bucks Sixers game sim, a single Hawks Jazz game sim, and a single Blazers Clippers game sim, use the projections that the players scored in those game sims, and then build the best lineup we can around it while also taking into account those players' ownership, right? That is what's happening here. Correlation is off by default. If correlation was on, we would also take into account the correlation the player has to one another as we build the lineup player by player. But in this case, correlation's off, right? The value of sim variance. What is the value of sim variance? It does a few things. First of all, it increases the upside of your lineups but it looks at real ranges of outcomes of players. This is a better alternative to what you may see in a traditional tool's randomness, right? A traditional randomness slider or setting that you might see on a traditional optimizer, if you set it to say 20% or something like that, will basically take a player's projection. It will take 80% of that projection and use that as kind of the low end, and it will take 120% of that player's projection and use it as the high end, and randomly pick out a game simulation there and set that player's projection to that for that individual lineup. Now, with SaberSim, right, we are actually sampling real game simulations here to determine the projections for each player when we build the lineup. So while in NBA, players are generally normally distributed and a traditional randomness tool might be better than it is in a sport like MLB, it's still not going to be perfect because it's not actually going to take into account the player's real full range of outcomes. So as sim variance gets higher, your lineups are going to have more upside at the expense of average performance. The impact of a big ceiling or floor game will have more impact on that player's projection in that lineup. And your lineups will also be more diverse and varied, right? The last thing I'll note about these sliders here is that they are back tested by building thousands of lineups at every single individual combination of sliders for the sport, the site, the slate size, and the contest you are playing. So you will see different sliders here, of course, if you change the contest, but also on different slate sizes. And a 3-game NBA slate, we're going to be playing it with a much more ownership fade and high variance approach than we would on yesterday's 8-game slate. I think on the 8-game slate yesterday, the defaults for this same size contest were like something like this, right? Maybe this, something like around here. So variance comes down. So the sim variance slider is really probably one of the most powerful things in SaberSim here that increases the upside of your lineups because it randomly samples real game scripts and real game simulations. It is not just a randomness slider. It's not just randomly applying a multiplier or a change to your individual player projections, right? It's actually sampling the individual game sims. And of course, I mentioned it here at the start, if you have updated player projections, right? So you've updated Giannis or something, or if you've updated every player in the pool, we're still going to leverage our game simulations when we build each lineup. But now, of course, all the individual game sims will be moved up or down here or there based on what you've done to individual players. So we're still taking into account your projections. So now let me go ahead and then kind of come back. So I've answered what the ownership fade slider is doing here, but let me kind of wrap back around here to these questions. So really the question was, why am I getting different results each time if the sim variance slider is set to 0? So the reason why, even if you turn sim variance down all the way to 0 and then build, is because for GPPs, we are assuming, first of all, that you're going to have a sim variance slider of a non-zero value most of the time, and because you're going to be building 500 or so lineups. When you have this GPP style set up here in style, we are not going to worry necessarily here about forcing the highest average projected lineups, mostly because that process is very time consuming. And if you're building 1,500 lineups and you already have a variance slider up, it doesn't really matter if you build the actual like optimal for any set of game simulations necessarily. It just matters if you get kind of close. If you want to see actual projected score optimals, you should change the style to cash, which builds lineups in a slightly different way and will actually build you mean projected optimal lineups. But this is something that, I mean, the style here is cash. This is something that really should only be used for cash games. I wouldn't recommend you do this for GPPs, right? Because even if you trust your projections here, right? I know, like, if you've worked very hard on your set of custom projections and you're very confident in them, we know that players don't always score their projection, right? That's obviously true. We can just look at a player's range of outcomes and see that. Even Giannis only scores his average 16% of the time, right? You also just know that if you've watched a basketball game or played DFS before, right? So that's kind of the value of the sim variance slider, is we don't want to just assume that a player is going to score. In fact, that's the failure of traditional optimizers, is that they assume a player is going to score their average projection 100% of the time. With sim variance, right, we actually get to randomly sample their real range of outcomes accordingly in a way that fits the contest type and the slate size and the sport that we're playing, right? So if you wanted to just build mean projected optimals, and maybe you're playing cash. If you're playing cash, then it's totally fine. But if you want to just build mean projected optimals, right, then you would want to use the cash builder, which does build lineups in a very slightly different way and will actually spend a little bit more time to build the lineups to make sure that they are the mean projected optimals. So even GPP settings of 000, you can potentially get you won't get very different lineups every time, but you can get slightly different lineups every time because the builder isn't seeking out the absolute mean projected optimal when style is set to GPP. I suspect that is also, so second question, I set James Conner and Chase Edmonds, 5,300 running backs to the same ownership and point projection, yet I'm getting different exposures for two different players. My best guess is that this has something to do with each player's range of outcomes. And so on. I think that the question here is basically the same thing, right? I imagine if you were building with GPP, you can get slightly different lineups either way. And I think this is an adjustment here for new players that does take some getting used to, that when you are going to be building on default settings with SaberSim, you are likely to get different lineups every single time you build. You are not going to get, I would not say you are going to get spectacularly different approaches to the slate overall, right? You are not, if we run this exact same build 2,500 over and over again, we're probably going to get different lineups. We will probably not get different approaches to the slate. We'll probably see that we are over and under the field on similar players every single time, but we're going to get different lineups. And that's an adjustment, right? With a traditional tool, if you built lineups with no randomness, right, you would get identical lineups every single time. But that, I think, really is a flaw of the traditional tools, because the reason you're getting the same projection, the lineups every single time, is because the assumption that is being made is that those players have a 100% chance of scoring their mean projected outcome. Whereas we are embracing the natural variance that exist in these games, right? And sampling that variance, sampling those game simulations accordingly. And our lineups are varied by default, right? Have variance then on their own. So hopefully that kind of helps clear some of that up here. Don't know if Wes happened to be watching me live here today. It looks like, actually, I just saw Max actually just responded here. So hopefully I got back. Hopefully maybe Max is listening to me today. Probably not, I guess, if he just responded. But we'll make sure that you see this recording here, Wes. And if you have any follow-up questions for me here, just let me know. Again, want to make sure that I'm doing a good job kind of explaining the value of this invariance slider, because I think it's really what is at play here. What is maybe causing some of your confusion here. But I think it's ultimately a big value add to your process that variance exists there. So anyway, going to move on here from now, for now. But let's go ahead and keep it moving here. So going to try to answer these questions here chronologically. This is a good question here from Epic Problem about late swap. And this comes in often. And he said, actual office hours question. With NBA in mind, at least, is late swap intended to be used principally after the first game has started and some players are now locked? Is it fine to just use late swap just prior to the start of the first games? Or is it preferable to generate fresh lineups? Or is there no difference at that stage? I would say in most average cases, you should just rebuild your lineups before lock. I think you get a few advantages from doing that. So the biggest advantage that you get by doing a full rebuild. So for what we're really talking about here is, like, let's say you've built some lineups and you're all prepped, and maybe 15 minutes before the slate starts, some news comes out and you need to make some updates, right? It is in general going to be preferable to rebuild and start with a fresh build, mostly because you're going to get another chance to build a full pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups or whatever you want, right? The reason why that's valuable is because then we can go through and sort those 500 lineups and find the best ones, the highest Saber score or projected score, if that's your sorting method, and identify what the best lineups out of the pool are, right? If you give the builder 500 shots to make a lineup, the top 20 it makes are going to be quite a bit better than if you only give it 20 shots, right? Now, the exception to that is, or I guess maybe the primary counterpoint to why you might want to use late swap is going to be faster. So while we've done a lot of improvements to the builder for this season, and we can build 500 lineups very quickly, if you are right up against time, like if you only have just a couple minutes or 5 minutes or less, it might be faster to just use the late swap tool and rebuild your 20 lineups. And the other thing that it can be useful is if you've spent a lot of time dialing in your exposures on step 3 and you've got your exposures in exactly where you want them to be, if you start over with a fresh brand new build, you're going to have to re-input all those exposures to that new build. Whereas with late swap, when you fill your lineups in with the entry editor, it will port over the associated min and max exposures you've set, and you can late swap much quicker, forcing the builder to keep those exposures intact. Now, I don't set a ton of exposures prior to lock for NBA, particularly for the exact reason that news can break that blows it all up here at the last second. But if you're going to spend the time setting all those exposures up, it may be more time efficient for you to just go in and late swap them so that it keeps track of all those exposures in that final build there. So I would say, again, on average, what I always do is if news comes out and it's close to lock, I'm almost always doing a fresh new build because I want that power of the full 500 or 1500 lineups in the pool. But if you're very short on time, or if you've set a lot of exposures and want those to come through in that late swap build, I think it can make a lot of sense to do a late swap. So, but cool. All right. Let's go ahead and see here. Keep it going. Answer some more questions here. GB has a few questions here. I'm gonna tackle these first, and then I think we'll go ahead and start answering some of the questions that have come in on YouTube here. Let's see. Let's get this one. This came in from Slack. And GB said, does the ownership fade slider impact Saber score? Sometimes the top 100 lineups via SaberSim are still very chalky, even when I move the slider farther to the right. Yes, it does. So Saber score, when you build your lineups, is going to be, it does take into account where the, let's go back. Let's start with a fresh build here. Oh, that was a test I was doing earlier here. Let me go ahead and just remove that. So Saber score is responsive to where you've set the sliders. So if you run a build and your ownership fade slider is at 4, right? And then you run another build and it's at 8, your Saber score, even if you had an identical lineup, it would be Saber scored differently because the ownership fade slider has changed, right? Oh, I don't want this max exposure at 40. I keep setting it there. That doesn't really matter. But yes, the short answer is yes. In terms of sometimes why sometimes your lineups might still be chalky, even if you move the slider farther to the right. So in NBA, right, we've been talking about this a lot yesterday. We talked about this a little bit yesterday with the Andre Drummond thing, right? We did this. This is the test I've been working on here. Let me do another build here. We had this question yesterday, though, of like somebody did a test where you turn Andre Drummond yesterday to 95% ownership and even crank your ownership fade slider way up, and you're still getting a ton of Drummond, right? Because players are normally distributed and their most common outcomes are centered around their means in NBA, you are going to get a lot of players, even if they are very chalky, if they are exceptionally well projected, right? We don't really have that player here tonight. Drummond got priced up. But yesterday he was 8x, right? His 25th percentile was like 7x his salary. If we looked at his range of outcomes, almost 95% of his game sims were over 6x value. It does not matter really at that point what his ownership fade slider is set at or what his ownership projection at, because he is just a spectacularly good play and has so much of a strong likelihood of reaching that value. I think he even exceeded it last night, right? He ended up having like probably an 85th percentile outcome. But that's why in NBA that's going to happen. Now, you will see that I think what happens here a lot too is that people look at the highest owned plays on the slate, which are often also the highest overall projected plays on the slate, crank their ownership fade up and crank the ownership fade slider up and crank their ownership up, and then think, why isn't this having any effect? Well, it is still actually having an effect. What it is having an effect primarily on is when you get down to these other plays that maybe are a little bit lower. They're not the highest overall. They're not the best overall projected plays on the slate. They're not necessarily the highest owned plays on the slate. They are the next kind of plays. They're the plays that aren't as good, that have an over-owned ownership projection. Those are the players that you're going to see actually really start to get impacted by the ownership fade slider. But on a slate like tonight, right, ownership fade is 6. If you wanted to maybe explore, even just crank it up even a little. Oh, no, I want to turn that max exposure down. I keep forgetting to do that. Let's crank this up. The ownership fade slider. Okay. Okay, so now we're good. And let's see what happens here. And I mean, we should see that we're able to get some leverage on some lower owned plays here. So yeah, I mean, you can see how fast 500 lineups are getting built now, but let's go ahead and make some adjustments here. Right. So you can see very high ownership fade here now, right? It's a 3-game slate. A lot of players are going to be owned, but we're going to see these plays sneak in here when that ownership fade slider creeps up. Now, does that mean we are under the field on Drummond, the highest projected owned play on the slate? Oh, no, not the highest projected owned play on the slate. Well, we are actually under the field on the highest projected owned play on the slate. We are not under the field on the best overall value play on the slate, I imagine, right? See, we're still well over the field on a chalky the best overall projected play on the slate. We're still over the field on a lot of the highest best projected plays on the slate because it's NBA and it's low variance. But it does still have an impact here. And I think this is a good thing, right? I think this is a strength, is that you can trust the ownership fade slider and approach things like, I want to be a little less chalky tonight, while also knowing that the builder is going to understand the difference between saying, there's a big difference between saying, I want to be a little less chalky tonight in NBA, and I want to be a little less chalky tonight in baseball, for example, right? In baseball, that means your lineup might be very, very contrarian. In basketball, doesn't need to, and it shouldn't be as much. So, few follow-up questions on that. I'm just going to hit real quick. KJ said, does the size of the slate affect the default slider settings? It does, yeah. So on a 3-game slate like tonight, you're getting a different set of sliders than you did last night on an 8-game slate. So your lineups are going to be probably much more high variance and much more higher ownership fade than they were last night. So really quickly, GB also had a question here, and I know there's been some back and forth about this particular question, but he said, can you please add an uncheck or check all button? It's so cumbersome to add or remove lineups if I want to start with them all checked or check all lineups with a certain player. I will say a couple things that are I'll just note here. If you want to take the approach of going in and like individually picking your 20, like I know some people like this approach. If you just set your lineups to 1 here, right, you can either make this part of the page much bigger and go through and look at your individual pool and start checking lineups in and picking your 20 that way. But I think the bigger question here of what was being asked is like a way to say, like, I want to make sure none of my lineups have Drummond and Reed. Let's just use that as an example, right? Maybe we do. So maybe what you're trying to do is you want to say, I want to look at all the lineups that have both of these guys and remove them all. Now, obviously, you can do this filter here and easily see them and just uncheck these 2 lineups, right? But if you had 150, this is a little bit more tedious. And if you're trying to do this with like multiple different player groups, it can be a pain. We are hopefully planning on adding some features here in the near future that will allow you to do this kind of thing with a lot more control. So you could group different players and say, remove all of these lineups or build more or edit exposures of other players while looking at lineups with these 2 combinations, all that kind of stuff. So I know this is a little bit tedious for now. That is coming though. So, okay, cool. So a few questions that came in right before the start of the stream here today in YouTube. Reed said, what's the difference between any negative and positive leverage? Do you want either in high upside context, staying away from similar? What's the difference of any? I would say if any. I think it's probably if any between negative and positive leverage. Well, they're 2 sides of the same coin, ultimately, right? You can't be over the field on everybody and you can't be under the field on everybody. So positive leverage, when your leverage column is positive, that is your exposure to the player minus the projected ownership. It is the percentage of lineups that you have more than the field does on average in the contest. Negative leverage is the opposite, right? So we have 27.8% less lineups in our pool of 20 than the field does, assuming the ownership projection is right. Right. So what you're ultimately hoping for, like a player that you have positive leverage on is a player that your pool of 20 or so lineups stands to gain more than the average lineup in the field does when that player succeeds. And a player that you are negatively leveraged on, right? Our 20 lineups will gain relative edge on the field if Bobby Portis fails in his spot tonight. But again, you can't, because the ownership sums up to the total ownership sum by position, right? Like the total ownership, well, with multi-positional eligibility, it gets kind of weird. But theoretically, if every player could only play one position, right? If every player was only eligible for one position, the ownership sum of all of the point guards would be 100%. So you couldn't possibly be over the field on every point guard in the pool, right? You have to pick some that you're going to be over the field on, and you have to pick some that you're going to be negative the field on. So they're two sides of the same coin. Those are your spots. Those are basically what you're saying there with your leverage. Is you're basically saying these are the spots where the field is being inefficient, right? The field is over owning players that I'm negatively leveraged on. The field is going to have too much Jordan Clarkson tonight. And vice versa, the field isn't going to have enough Tyrese Maxey. So two sides of the same coin. You have to have both. The more positive leverage you have on a player, the more negative leverage you are having on other players in the pool. Nancy Drew guy said, when should we leave the pool size at 500? When should we bump up the pool size to 1,500? Yeah, good question. So I think by default right now, it pretty much just stays at 500 almost all the time. I would say this, at the very least, and this is something that we're just going to change here because it should be this way. If you're building 150 or more lineups, put your pool size at 1,500. That's the way it should be by default. And we're going to make it by default here in the near future, but it's not that way at the moment. If you just set your sliders to like 150 max, pool size is 500. I would recommend for 150 lineups, just upgrading this to 1,500. Otherwise though, if you're building less than 150 lineups, I think there's a few things to consider. One is how much time you have. If you have time for it, often might as well make the adjustment to 1,500 lineups, right? Build more lineups. It also depends on how many exposure edits you plan on making. If you know you're not going to touch exposures in step 3 at all, you don't need 1,500 extra lineups, especially if you're only going to build 40, right? Maybe you're playing 40 lineups. You don't need 1,500 if you're not even going to touch the exposures in step 3. The other thing that comes into play is how much time you have. So 1,500 lineups is going to take longer to build than 500. Just makes sense, right? So if you don't have a ton of time, maybe you only have 5 or 10 minutes before lock, it might make more sense to just build 500 so that the build completes sooner and you don't need the full 1,500. So the final consideration is if you're playing far less than 20 lineups, right? Like if you're playing just 3 or a single entry, you may not even need 500. Right? 500 is going to build really fast no matter what, so you might as well just build them. But if you're just building a single entry or a 3 max, like I wouldn't even think about cranking this up to 1,500. There's just no way you need that many lineups. So I would say ultimately considerations are how many lineups are you actually building, how much time do you have, and how many adjustments are you making in step 3. The more adjustments you're making in step 3, the more time you have, the more lineups you're building, the more it makes sense to pump up pool size. So Sean T, in response to my comment about the new feature, said, "Oh, that would be huge, Jordan. SaberSim is going to take over. Having control with this tool is going to be a cheat code." Yeah, we're pretty excited about that, especially with, I know Max has been on here a bit in the recent past talking about the things that he likes to do with the filters, like things that he does to add value with using the filters to particularly like pick out certain lineups that have combinations of players and things like that, especially on Showdown and things like that. So I think it's going to be pretty sweet. We're pretty excited about that, but Jack said, should your lineups be positive, EV, neutral, or a little negative value? And does it depend on the entries? Well, obviously, we're hoping to build plus EV lineups, right? We want lineups that have positive expected value, right? That's a good thing. That's how we're profitable. But taking this more from the stance of like variance, like should your lineups on any given slate be positive or neutral or a little negative value? Well, actually, no. From an expected value standpoint, right, you always want your lineups to be positive, right? Now, you're not going to realize your value on every single slate, but your lineups, you always want to be building positive right? That's kind of the whole point about expected value. It's like if you played this slate out thousands of times, your expectation of delivered value on a given lineup, what would it be, right? So that should always be a positive number. Does it depend on the entries? I think that's an interesting question. There is a theoretical limit of how many plus EV lineups you can build on a given slate. On a NBA main slate or a football main slate, you are never realistically going to hit that limit, right? There are probably tens of thousands of plus EV lineups that you can build for a football main slate. For a NFL showdown, maybe in a contest like a Millie Maker where the prizes are all up top and you are fighting the problem of duplication. And maybe even like something on FanDuel, right? FanDuel gives you less ways to make single entry. Like FanDuel has only 5 players in the single entry lineup. And because you don't pay extra for the player in your multiplier position, there are less viable lineups that you can make because there are less viable MVPs to use on FanDuel, right? So taking, for example, the giant FanDuel GPP for some random NFL showdown. In that contest, I think there's an argument to be made that you could theoretically build too many lineups that some of them are not positive EV. I think that's getting really into the weeds there. But I think if someone told me that there were only, I don't know, a couple hundred plus EV lineups for a FanDuel NFL showdown, I'd probably buy that. But I think I'm probably getting too into the weeds here for this particular question. And I would say just in general, thinking about expected value, your goal is always to enter positive EV lineups for the contest you are playing. Guy Will Gamble said, at what bankroll threshold do you recommend to start playing cash games in a sport? It depends on the sport and it depends on what contests are out there. Both on the GPP side and the cash game side, right? The bigger sports, the higher volume sports, NFL and NBA in particular, are going to have a lot more GPPs, good GPPs to play. And they're going to have better cash games at all, right? So like for NFL, it would be an enormous amount of volume. There's so many good GPPs to play in NFL before I would even think about playing cash. So it would be a different number. In NBA, I actually broke this down exactly in this video here on our YouTube channel. Crush NBA DFS in 2021 by playing the best contest. In this video, I actually talk about the exact breakpoint where I would start playing NBA cash games because you have enough bankroll, you're maxing out all of the best GPPs, and at that point, playing some low stakes head-to-heads and single entry double ups, I think is smart. So I talk about that exact point for both FanDuel and DraftKings in this video. I would go watch it. For football, I don't think so. We have a similar video for football here that's called How to Double Your NFL DFS ROI. I don't actually think we actually get into the exact point you would maybe start to work in cash games in this video. It is going to be basically pretty far. I mean, it's going to be a pretty big roll. Like you would be playing, I would say, every single GPP that has 1,000 or more effective entrants with like a decent payout structure. It's probably triple what it would be in the NBA version. I can't remember exactly where the threshold was. I think it was, I don't even remember, $10,000 or $15,000 bankroll, playing 5% of your bankroll every night in NBA would probably be that point. But I would probably recommend, again, just if you're trying to maximize ROI, if you're only playing on DraftKings, I would recommend going and playing the best GPPs on FanDuel and Yahoo before I started playing cash on DraftKings, would be my personal approach. So. Cool. Neil said, I'm assuming if we're using ceiling projections from another source rather than an average projection, it would make more sense to turn off sim variance. Okay, so I wouldn't go this way. I wouldn't go this way. It's going to be the same problem that I was talking about before. So let's say you hypothetically do that, right? So first of all, let's say you have ceiling projections from another source and you load them into the app, right? And you turn off sim variance. What you are then going to do is you still have the same problem from before. You're taking every player in the pool and assuming that they essentially have a 100% chance to hit that ceiling outcome, right? Now we've just changed. Instead of looking at an average projection, we're looking at a ceiling projection. To make it even worse, if you have ceiling projections from some other source, what they probably are is they are probably ceiling projections that are assuming a normal distribution for a player. They're basically taking a player's mean and historical standard deviation, assuming a normal distribution. So let me make this clear. What they're assuming is that a player's range of outcomes looks like a bell curve, right? A perfect bell curve. Now in basketball, it's not going to be a huge problem. It's going to be accurate. In football, it can be a big problem, right? Players are still somewhat normally distributed, but not really, and definitely not when these edges matter, right? Like Lamar Jackson, this isn't a perfect normal distribution. Lamar Jackson's ceiling projections, assuming a normal distribution for Lamar Jackson, would actually probably undershoot his actual real ceiling, right? But the main reason why you don't want to do this is because at that point you're not appropriately sampling that player's real range of outcomes in accordance with how often they hit those outcomes, right? That's the value of using sim variance. The main value you get out of this is you are sampling the real ranges of outcomes from our game simulations appropriately as it fits not only the sport and the slate size, but also the contest, right? If we're playing the Millie Maker for football, we want to take a very high variance approach. We're going to take single game simulations for football and try to optimize a good lineup, right? And if we roll a lineup where, I don't even know, let's pick somebody weird, where Jared Goff has 31 fantasy points, then great. We're playing a Jared Goff lineup, right? Because we need that level of variance. But if we're playing a single game, a single entry, small 500 person single entry, right? It's totally different story. We're certainly not playing Jared Goff. We're going to take a bigger bucket of the game simulations and determine the best lineups from there. Right. So that's the flaw. Like that's what you give up when you give up sim variance is you give up the ability to pull from these game simulations and these game scripts that we have from our sims and actually pull in the player's real ranges of outcomes and how often they get there. But you also lose all of your nuance of the individual sport and the contest type and all of that. So what I would recommend more as an alternative here, if you have a different source of projections that you like, which is totally fine, go get their average projections, but keep using and upload them, but keep using the sim variance slider as it is set. That is by far going to be a higher expected value approach. So, cool. Cody said, what about situations where you don't agree with the range of outcomes? In NHL, I've noticed that high-priced D have too low and 99th percentile, and jumping up their projections 3 points won't fix that. That's a good question. That is a very interesting question. If you have a disagreement with overall what the range of outcomes looks like for a player, there's obviously not a very clean-cut way to edit that, right? So first of all, like to be clear, what we're saying here is not that you disagree with the projection, right? If you disagree with Dak's projection, I'm just going to use NFL as an example. All you do, Dak is too high, you adjust him down, right? You're actually saying in this case you agree with really the curve of the range of outcomes. That maybe like the actual range of outcomes curve is incorrect. First of all, I would say, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think it's very unlikely that is ever the case for NFL, baseball, or basketball. Those models are things that we have put an immense amount of work into to get where they are. So I would say there. With NHL, you've picked kind of an interesting point here where I could definitely sympathize with the idea that maybe there are certain ranges of outcomes for players that are a little bit off. I think the best advice I could give you in that particular case is think about what impact you want that to have on your lineups and take the direct route to making that adjustment. Like, you can't change the range of outcomes for a player, right? So you're saying high price D have too low of a 99th percentile, right? We can't go in here and make Dougie Hamilton's 99th percentile higher here, right? But you can get more of these players. And you could do that by either just bumping up their mean projection, right? which obviously is going to shift the whole range of outcomes. It doesn't necessarily solve the theoretical problem here, but it will get more of those players in your lineups. You could also just increase their exposure and pick your certain spots, increasing your exposure to players in step 3. That'd be what I would recommend. So, again, not going to be able to solve the theoretical disagreement of the range of outcomes in the app, right? You can't pump up his 99th percentile, but you can increase his average projection and I would say get the result you're looking for, or just increase the exposure to that player you have in step 3. I think the easiest thing to do would be to just bump up, pick, if you're saying it's high price D, right? I would say pick your spots and bump the player's mean projections up. Because it is ultimately going to have the right impact, right? What actually happens there is this entire outcome curve just gets shifted, right? So it is going to have the impact of increasing that player's 99th percentile on a practical level. So Cody said, I agree, those models look better, but NHL has some oddities to me. I think we would own that. Again, I think our NHL model is very good. I think, again, in a high variance sport, high correlation sport, SaberSim is kind of primed to excel. But I think it is a very difficult sport to model and to simulate. And it's something that I think we want to spend some time improving and adding value to. This, I mean, to be completely frank, there was a huge push for NBA for the start of this season. And I think the NHL model could use a little love. So I'm going to move us on for now, though. Eric said, when playing multiple contests, for example, 20 max and 150 max entry on NBA on FanDuel in step 2, should I run 2 builds based on entry limit and entrance? Does it hurt to do all 170 lineups in one build? Again, this is one of those situations where there are reasons to do it either way, and there are different situations, right? The primary value you are going to get, there are 2 main advantages you'll get out of grouping everything together. And I will first say, I always group everything together. So if I'm playing, I will play, maybe if I'm playing 50 lineups across single entries and the 20 max and 3 maxes and all this different stuff on a different slate, I will just build everything together, right? And again, the two primary advantages you get out of that is, well, I guess there's a few, maybe 3. One is it's faster. You only have one build, right? You only have to worry about one build. 2 is that you can edit all of your exposures there in that one single build and manage your exposures for the entire slate all together, which is really nice, right? You don't have to do it multiple times. And 3 is, you're guaranteed to get a unique lineup into every single entry, right? Because we're not going to build you a duplicate lineup in one set of builds. Now, the advantages to doing it the other way, I guess maybe there's really just one primary advantage to doing it the other way, is that you are going to have the sliders precisely dialed into what they are for the particular contest, right? That would be the main advantage. So the sliders are back tested for a certain contest type. If you enter your sliders that are here for a 20 max 10 to 50K and put that into a single entry at 1,000 to 10,000, you are theoretically playing a lineup that could potentially have too high of variance and too high of ownership fade for this particular contest. Now, with that said, I am willing to sacrifice some of that for the value of building it all together, having a unique lineup in every single contest, and being able to edit my exposures all in one place. I would say, in general, the differences between your individual sliders are not going to be so impactful that I would worry about them until you're seeing differences of maybe 3 notches in one direction or another. So if you're talking about, in this particular case, you're playing NBA on FanDuel and you're comparing a 20 max to a 150 max, right? So let's say your 20 max contest is here, right? 069, and your 150 max is 0610. That is going to have a very, very minor impact on your lineups overall, and I would not really sweat that. I would be totally fine doing that. Even if it was up here at 50K, right? It doesn't even change, 0610. That difference in slider is going to be so small in the impact it actually has on your lineups. Any differences you'd see between those 2 builds at those 2 different settings is probably just the sim variance itself showing through, and I would build them all together. But Now, if you told me you were playing a 150 max with over 50K people, maybe you're playing the 5 cent 150 max, and you're playing one single entry that has 1,000 people in it, right? Or maybe 500 people in it, right? Now we're talking about a difference from 0.35 to 0.610. You could potentially build a lineup for that single entry here if you grouped it together with that 150 max that really was much more high variance and much more ownership fade than needed for that single entry contest. I think you could justify building that lineup separately. Now, again, one of the things that can come up is you could duplicate that lineup. That lineup that you build for the single entry contest might have already shown up in your 150 max build, indicating that it's viable in both contests. But now maybe you may dupe yourself in between contests, which isn't necessarily a huge deal, depending on the way you look at it, but it can come up. So average situation for the average case, if you're kind of just looking like, just tell me what to do, I would just always group everything together. I think it's easier. I think you add a ton of value by avoiding any duplication between your lineups. I think the differences between the sliders don't present that much of a difference in EV for the contest, and you get to do all your exposures in one place. But those are the things to think about overall. So this question also comes through in late swap as well. People ask the same question for late swap. And for late swap, I am even more compelled to group everything together just because you're going to be doing it so many times throughout the night. And it's kind of a pain to late swap multiple times. So, but Don said, is it true that the default settings on the sliders is what is recommended? That is true. Those are back tested, data-driven defaults. But do you see any scenarios when they should be adjusted manually? There are definitely certain situations where you might want to adjust your sliders. I think a big reason why you might want to adjust your sliders is if you are doing something that is creating the impact that the sliders have already. So for example, right, the slider that I am most likely to touch overall is the ownership fade slider. And I think one of the best reasons why you might want to touch the ownership fade slider, and this is something that I know Max has mentioned he does before, is that Max makes a lot of adjustments to his projections. But the way that he likes to do it is that he will kind of bake in some fades of players into those adjustments for projections already, right? They're not necessarily just like pure average projections. They're kind of like contrarian multipliered average projections, right? So like maybe if you make an adjustment and you say, I'm going to knock Giannis down to 50.9, right? Maybe that's not so much, I think Giannis's more accurate projection is 50.9. It's that I'm kind of thinking that I want that to be kind of my fade on the slate. And if you're doing that and you're already tweaking projections, kind of thinking about some of that, I think it can make sense then to knock down your ownership fade slider maybe a little bit because you've kind of already baked that into the projections. Or if you maybe are even taking a much more extreme approach and you're just removing players from your pool completely, then maybe it makes sense. Like if you're removing some really high projected owned players from your pool or high owned players from your pool already, then maybe it makes sense to turn down your ownership fade slider a little bit. That I think is the best example I think one other situation where it could potentially be valuable is if you've changed the ownership projections and spent some time researching and you think that you've added value and made the ownership projections more accurate. I've always thought it could be an interesting idea to just tick the ownership fade slider up like even just one extra spot to capitalize on the value you've added by making the projections more accurate. But to be completely honest, there aren't a lot of other situations where I think it makes sense to change the sliders. I want to say in particular, one situation where I don't think you should change the sliders that I think people do, and I want to make this one very clear, is people will go for NFL in particular, or a sport where they are stacking. And if Mr. Clean is watching, he might disagree because Mr. Clean basically made this exact statement on our NHL strategy session. And frankly, I disagree a little bit. But one thing I see people do is they will go in and they'll set a stacking rule and say, I want to have at least 3 players from the same team, don't include defense. So my stacks are now incorporated. So now I can turn correlation down, right? And I think that's a bad idea. And the reason why I think that's a bad idea is because even once you set the stacking rule, right? The correlation slider is what determines who the best players are to stack in that lineup, right? You want the players. Josh Allen has a different correlation to his different receivers. Not spectacularly different, maybe not a very good example. Let's see, maybe Brady. A little bit different. Maybe pick a skill position player, right? I guess the point here is that, or you know what, running backs is a good example, I guess, in particular, right? Running backs across the league have very different correlations to their quarterbacks depending on how talented both of those two players are and how often the running back catches passes. And if you just set this rule and turn down the correlation slider, you strip the builder of its ability to recognize when it makes sense to have a running back in the stack, right? So that is one particular example where I think it is a very bad idea to make adjustments to the correlation slider. And I do see people do that. And I think that can be a mistake. I think Mr. Clean has a very nuanced understanding of hockey correlations overall and manages to set really good stacking rules and identify strong lineups, so it doesn't matter as much. But I would recommend for the average person, don't go changing your correlation slider down just because you set a stacking rule. It's still valuable for you there. Sim variance. Is there a situation where I would edit sim variance for an actual lineup build? I don't really think so. I really don't touch these that much. I really don't. It's the least important part of my process. And you guys, you can see it if you've watched some of these videos I put out recently. The one where I did my NFL lineups live on stream or my baseball lineups, right? I gloss over this whole section. Kind of don't even care. The sliders are good enough where they are. So anyone that's winning, also, I'll say this. There's a lot of times somebody has a huge night and they, bink something, post it on Twitter, go to the winner's circle. I always see people say, what sliders did you use? That's not what got them there. Willing to guarantee it, right? It was not, you are never the right sliders away from a bink on a given slate. It is the other ways you add value by editing your exposures, editing projections, things like that. Sometimes just variance too. But it is the other things you are doing. So, Kenneth asks an interesting question here. With tonight being a 3-game slate, does it make sense to lower the max salary? Man, interesting one. I don't think so for 3 games, but it is right on that line, right? Maybe if you're playing the biggest contests, if you are playing some of the biggest contests that are out there, the whole reason we would do this is to avoid duplication, right? I don't think you're very likely to get duplicated on a slate like this, on a 3-game slate still. But if you're playing contests with a ton of entries, it's definitely possible. I also, since it's NBA, I'm a little more concerned with doing that. In NBA, players' fantasy point, their actual fantasy point production is much more highly correlated with their salary. And leaving salary on the table is going to sacrifice more projection. So I'm a little more concerned about doing it that way. I think on a 2-game slate, if you're telling me that you're playing the big contests, you might be able to sell me on it. But I don't know on a 3-game. If you do, I would just take a very light touch, maybe 100. But I don't even know if I would. So it's close, but good question. And it's a good thought for sure, because I think it's thinking about it the right way, right? Slate's getting smaller, less viable players in a player pool, more likely to be duplicated. But I still don't think I would. So Lundar says, do you ever change exposures in step 1? Just wondering if you're less likely to run into lineup constraint issues if you tweak exposure on the front end. You are less likely to run into lineup constraint issues, right? Because you're telling the builder what you want beforehand. That said, I almost never do. I want to know if I'm hitting lineup constraint issues, because then what I get to know is the builder is saying, hey, dude, of the first 1,500 lineups that we think are viable for this contest, you are making changes that exceed that. And I treat that as a red flag. And that's what I always recommend you guys do as well. Like, if you see we can't meet your exposures on step 3, I would shift your reaction from being like, hey, this is what's going on here, the tool's not working, to what I am trying to do on this slate exceeds the best 1,500. Actually, first of all, build 1,500 lineups. But this exceeds the first 1,500 lineups that SaberSim thinks is viable for this contest. And I should check myself here. Does that mean SaberSim is always right always listen to SaberSim. If SaberSim says no, then the answer is no. No, that's not the case. But it should mean that I would go back to maybe wherever you got your research or wherever you got your opinions on how you're going to tackle the slate and double check that, right? Is that a gut? Do you have a gut call that's leading you to just fading Giannis 100% and the builder's like, that's not viable? Maybe you check that. Do you have like a really well-researched piece of content from somebody that you trust that makes you think that maybe Giannis is a good fade for some reason tonight? Then maybe you say, yeah, no, that's actually really good research. The builder's not taking that into account. And I want to make sure that I am well under the field on Giannis tonight. And then you can set max exposure here, step one, and the builder kind of will know what you're doing and knowing what you're trying to accomplish and build you a better set of lineups for it. The other approach, obviously, is to change the projection. But the max exposure can be useful if you know exactly what you want that exposure value to be. But that said, I very rarely touch these. Yesterday, I think I said on stream, I don't think I've ever even used them once since we've added these, because most of the time, if I start tweaking, messing around with stuff, and I get that message saying that I need to build more lineups, I walk something back. So, cool. Got some kind words from people here. Jack, Neil, Reed, Eric. I'm glad I could help you guys all out here. Cody said he's printed money in NHL. That's always good to hear. Reed said, if I change sliders and then take off manual mode, do the sliders default to? My settings. I'm a little confused here. My settings are a setting of, say, 225 when it had 338. It still shows 338, but do they go to a different setting? You shouldn't be able to change your sliders unless manual mode is on, right? So when you change these drop downs, they're going to default to whatever the appropriate amount is for that contest that you're playing, right? So this is for a 3 max 1,000 here. If you turn manual mode on and like mess around with this and start tweaking these around, right? And if you ever want to know how to get back to the default values, just change this again to something else and then go back to what you were looking at before. And it should go back to the defaults. So that's how that works. Hopefully I answered your question there. If I missed something, just let me know. Let's see. Sean said, let's see, let me get the question up on screen. He said, do you personally make a player pool for NFL? Using 25 running backs and 65 wide receivers on a 150 max build can't be good, right? I don't, honestly. I know maybe it sounds, again, like a little bit of a broken record here, but I think so much of the nuance that is missed in DFS in general is contest strategy, specific strategy, right? And things like player pools miss some of that, right? Like your viable player pool, how many quarterbacks and running backs and wide receivers it makes sense to roster changes so much between what makes sense for a 20 max contest and a 150 max contest of varying different sizes. The sim variance slider is, again, going to be the biggest impact to how big your player pool is by default. And this is a slider that has been back tested to its position. So I don't normally curate a player pool before I run my build. Now I will make adjustments. I will make adjustments after, right? Where I will manage exposures and maybe eliminate players or lower max exposures to certain players in step 3. But the difference of what is happening there is, even if you are eliminating a player from your pool, in theory, what you've actually done is you've just eliminated a set of lineups that include that player, right? So you're just filling in with new different lineups. And I like knowing that. I like knowing that instead of having this brute force impact on the player pool of players that the builder can use to build lineups, I would rather eliminate full lineups that I don't want to play, even if it is by way of adjusting max exposure to a specific player. Because again, this is just my strategy, is I really, really like to leave things as flexible and as wide open as possible until after the build. And it all just kind of speaks to the way that I think about the tool, right? Even thinking about the last question, right? Or 2 questions ago, I think, right? Why I think about that message saying you need to change your exposures, or you need to build more lineups to fit your exposures. Like, why is that a red flag to me? Well, because I am feeding the builder what I think are an accurate set of inputs, right? Even if I've made some projection edits, if I've made some ownership edits, those two things I am a little bit more likely to do on step one. I'll use the sliders that we feel are optimal for the contest, right? Again, something I don't really touch. And then I get this pool of 1,500 lineups that the builder says, like, these are the 1,500 different ways to play this contest. And then I go in and say, these are the best ones of that group. This is the best. This is the right player pool, and so on. So I don't think, like, talking about really like directly what's in this question, using 25 running backs and 65 wide receivers on a 150 max build can't be good, right? I'm curious what we get out of this. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at surface level here. I'd be curious what we were getting here out of this with the default, with just kind of running a build. Now, let me put it this way, actually. I don't think there is the expected value of any given lineup that you are entering into this contest is not impacted by the fact that in your other 150 lineups, you have a pool of 24 other running backs you are using, right? One individual lineup, any individual lineup you're entering in the contest is not more likely to win now because of what the pool of running backs looks like in your other lineups, right? This is a risk. The size of your player pool is ultimately going to be more of a risk management question. Limiting your player pool and saying, I'm only going to play 10 running backs instead of 25 is going to make your lineups riskier, but you are going to have a higher potential ceiling when you are right on your pool. Having 25 overall running backs is going to make you have lower risk overall with a lower potential ceiling if you're right, because you have to be right about more all at once, right? Like, we have 24 different running backs here. So, like, we could be, if we have 25 running backs in the pool and Cordarrelle Patterson is the highest scoring running back on the slate, well, we've got 14 shots at it, right? But that may not be enough. Now, if we only played a pool of, let's say we only use 6 running backs, right? And our last one in the pool that made it in was Cordarrelle Patterson. Well, we'd have a ton more lineups with Cordarrelle Patterson in it and have way more shots at that being the highest scoring lineup. But let's say Austin Eckler was the highest scoring running back on the slate, and we had eliminated from our pool to consolidate, right? Then we have no shot. We have 0 lineups that have a realistic shot. So it's kind of a risk management standpoint. And I think Sean said makes total sense. Jordan, thanks. Yeah, I think the last thing I'll note on this is that this is a really important concept to think about when you're thinking about your lineups, is that when you're thinking about things like how many players are in my pool, how many running backs do I have, how many wide receivers do I have, none of that actually impacts the expected value of any given lineup. And that's really important to think about what then is the purpose of this thing, right? What you're actually thinking about is risk management. And if you can identify, this is actually kind of getting into a little bit of what I want to talk about in my strategy session on Thursday, but if you can identify why you're looking at something, right? Looking at the size of your player pool is a good idea. It's important. But the reason it's important is because it allows you to manage your risk. It doesn't actually necessarily increase the expected value of any given lineup. That's an important thing to know. And then that can give you a little more guidance on answering that question too, of like, how many running backs do I want? Well, how risky do I want to be? What contests am I playing? That kind of thing. So good question though. Cool. KJ has a question here and said, bankroll management question, which I always love, always welcome these. I've been playing 2% of my bankroll in NBA GPP this year, and the idea of going to 5% per night makes me a little nervous. 1.7% top 1% finishes and 38% ROI this season. Nervous about 5% a night, but obviously don't want to miss out on the potential increase in profit. Just wanted your thoughts when to decide to bump up your per night amount. Yeah, first of all, our 5% per night thing is absolutely a top end maximum, right? That is not a recommended mean, a recommended average amount to play. That is our top end highest, up to 5% per night. There's nothing wrong with playing 2% of your bankroll on your slate. It is going to depend a lot on what that size of the bankroll is, and also what that bankroll really means, right? If you have a $1,000 bankroll and you could realistically replenish it if you went broke, then you don't really have 1,000%. You don't really have $1,000 bankroll. You have a bigger bankroll than that. And if you were playing $50 a night, that's probably totally fine. If you have I don't know what the number is for you in particular, but if you have a $100,000 bankroll or something like that, and that is your legitimate role, like that is what you are playing with, or if you are making a legitimate side income from your play, right? Like if you're playing 5% per night and you're putting $5,000 in a night and you have a bad 2 weeks, right? You could decimate that bankroll. That could be a huge problem potentially for your income. So I would say that's kind of the way I would think about this here is, first of all, 5% of the night is the maximum. Nothing wrong with playing less than that. And as your bankroll gets bigger, it is going to make sense to play much less, depending on your overall risk of ruin. Yeah, you may sacrifice a little bit of ROI, or not ROI. You may sacrifice a little bit of return, like raw profit, but the bigger your bankroll is, the more that risk of ruin becomes a significant risk, and honestly, the less that lost profit even maybe really matters there. So, but I always say if a slate ever locks and you start sweating immediately, you played too much. And if a slate ever ends and you're upset, you played too much. So if you're playing 2% and when the slate locks, you can look at it and be like, hey, whatever happens, happens. This is just one night. Great. And if the slate ends and you brick the whole slate and lose all of it, and you can look back and say, hey, it's one slate, doesn't matter. Great. Then you're playing the right amount of bankroll. If you start playing more and you start sweating as soon as that slate locks, or if you're upset at the end of the night because of how much you lost, you played too much, probably far too much. So that's how I'd answer that question. And there's definitely a big difference from when you're talking about money that is like kind of more play money, or money that you could easily replenish if you were to lose it. And when things actually start being like a side income kind of thing, definitely want to think about that differently. And then the last thing, of course, is that like 1.7% top 1% equity and a 38% ROI is amazing, but it is early and it's a small sample size this season. So maybe we'll regress a little bit to more of a mean value there. But that's not an absurd number. If you told me you had 3.5% top 1% finishes and a 200% ROI, I would tell you to expect some regression. This number is definitely sustainable, but you may still see some regression there. So, but anyway, that's all I see for questions here today. We'll go ahead and leave it there. We're right at about the hour mark. I think I got to everything here today. So thank you to everybody that asked questions or contributed or commented in the chat here today. Let's see. One more. We'll hit this one more question here. Phil said, when is it appropriate to withdraw from your bankroll? Are you waiting until the season is over? That's ultimately your call. That's up to you. I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer there. I think if I was to try to come up with like a kind of scientific answer to this, I would say, think about where you made that money. And if to get additional, so as your bankroll grows, right? If to get additional action down in the contests, you need to start playing contests that aren't the ones where you made your money, then I would probably first try to dabble in those with a smaller investment and see if you can keep up your edge. So like, let me put it this way. Let's say you are crushing low stakes multi-entry NBA DFS and you are playing like the $1 20 max, the quarter juke. Maybe you're playing even the mini max, not my favorite contest for basketball, but maybe you're playing that and you're crushing and you've turned a over the course of a season, because of a couple huge hits or something like that, you've turned a $1,000 bankroll into a $10,000 bankroll. And now maybe you're going into next season and you need to decide like what you're going to do, right? You could pocket $9,000 in profit, call it a great season, and go into next year, right? Great. Or you could play with that money, right? You could keep that in. Well, to play with that money and to stay in, you're going to jump over the $3 threshold of where under $3 players with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings can't enter those contests. So you're going to play against harder opponents. You may play top heavier contests. Maybe you need to start dabbling in single entry, right? Because you're filling up all of the low stakes multi-entry. Maybe you start playing football. I mean, pretty much everybody plays football. Maybe you start playing hockey, or I don't know. You're changing something. You're playing contests that are different than where you made that money. I think that's where you should at least pause and maybe say, like, am I still going to be profitable in these new contests that aren't the ones where I made this money in? Should I withdraw this if you want to withdraw it, right? That's where I would at least think about that. I mean, obviously, there's an entire other question if you win life-changing money, right? Like, that's an individual decision you need to make for yourself. Where that line is. So, but that's definitely not a question that I can sit up here and say I know the answer for every single person. Going to depend on what that money looks like. But I would say where you should at least have pause and question and ask, like, take a moment to think, is if you have won an amount of money that is going to require you to change your contests you are playing and venture out of the contest where you made that money. So, but I will leave it there for now. So I will be right back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you have questions as you are building your lineups for tonight's contest, always feel free to email us, support@sabersim.com, or fire them off into the Office Hours channel in Slack. Until then, enjoy the slates tonight. Good luck, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. See ya.